There are moments in life when you realize someone has been taking from you for so long, so quietly, that by the time you find out, the only feeling left is not anger. It is something colder than that, something that makes you sit very still and start to plan. I have been an electrical engineer for going on 20 years. I have designed power systems for industrial plants, for facilities where a single miscalculation does not just trip a breaker, it shuts down an entire production floor and cost people their jobs. I am not a man who misreads data. I am not a man who jumps to conclusions. So when I sat down at my workbench one morning with a cup of coffee and pulled up the monitoring logs from my off-grid solar system, and I saw what those logs were telling me, I did not get angry right away. I just looked at the numbers. Then I looked again. Then I printed every single page. 22 nights, the same load pattern, the same draw time, the same connection starting somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning and running until just before sunrise. For 3 weeks straight, while I was asleep inside my house, someone had been walking up to a private charging outlet on my property and using my electricity to charge their car. Not once, not by accident, 22 times, with the kind of consistency that tells you this was never a mistake. This was a decision someone made and kept making, night after night, because they believed they could. That someone was my neighbor, 3 houses down, the president of our homeowners association. And this is the story of what happened after I found out. Now, I want to be straightforward with you before we go any further. This is not a story about screaming matches in the front yard, although there was one of those. It is not just a story about one entitled neighbor, although Carol Simmons is genuinely one of the most entitled people I have ever encountered in my life. This is really a story about something most of us have felt at one point or another, the particular helplessness of being treated like your property, your time, your work, and your rights simply do not matter to the person standing in front of you. And more than that, it's about what happens when you stop trying to explain yourself to someone who was never listening in the first place. I spent $30,000 and 2 years of my life building that solar system. Weekends, holidays, nights after work when the rest of the neighborhood was watching television and I was in the garage wiring battery banks and running cable through the attic. I built it because I wanted independence, real independence, not the kind that comes with a lower electric bill, but the kind where you flip a switch and you know without question that the power flowing through that wire belongs to you, every watt of it. Carol Simmons decided it belonged to her too. What I'm going to walk you through today is the entire sequence of events, from the first time she showed up in my driveway with a clipboard to the night her Tesla went dark in front of my house and she screamed loud enough to wake half the block, to the morning she came back with 2 HOA board members and a complaint that collapsed the second I handed them a binder of evidence I had been building for weeks. I'm also going to talk about the legal side of this, what the HOA actually can and cannot do, what constitutes theft of utility under most state laws, and why the yellow warning sign I posted above that charger turned out to be one of the most important decisions I made through this entire ordeal. I'm going to tell you what I wish I had done differently, and I'm going to tell you what I would do exactly the same way if I had to start over from the beginning. But I want to start where this story really begins, not the night I caught her, not the morning I found the logs. It starts earlier than that. It starts the first afternoon Carol Simmons walked into my driveway, looked up at my solar panels, tapped her clipboard, and smiled the kind of smile that doesn't mean anything good. Because everything that came after, every conflict, every late night at the monitoring console, every spark, started with that smile. And if you've ever had someone look at something you built, something you worked for and earned, and decided without a word spoken that it was somehow theirs to take, then you already know exactly how this story felt from the inside. Stay with me, because the ending is worth it. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that you cannot buy, cannot borrow, and nobody can take from you. And that is the feeling of knowing you built something with your own hands that actually works. I want to start there, before any of the conflict, before Carol Simmons ever set foot on my driveway. Because if you do not understand what that system meant to me, you will not fully understand why what she did felt like such a violation. My name is Gary Holloway. I have been an industrial electrical engineer for going on 19 years. Most of that work has been in power distribution, control panels, load management, the kind of work where your margin for error is essentially zero. Because when something goes wrong at that scale, it doesn't just flip a breaker, it shuts down a floor, it costs people their jobs, it puts workers at risk. That kind of work teaches you a certain discipline, a certain way of thinking about electricity, not as something invisible and abstract, but as something real and measurable and entirely understandable if you are willing to do the work of understanding it. So, when I decided, about 4 years ago, to build a fully off-grid solar system for my home, I did not go to a retailer and buy a package deal. I sat down at my workbench and I designed it myself. I calculated the load requirements for every room in the house, every appliance, every seasonal variation in power demand. I sourced the components individually, solar panels for the roof and the back shed, 3 battery banks in the garage, custom inverters, manual transfer panels. I spent close to $30,000 over about 2 years, most of it on weekends and evenings, sometimes holidays, working in that garage while the rest of the neighborhood was watching television or grilling in the backyard. When I finished it and flipped the main switch for the first time, the whole house ran without the grid for a week straight. Every light, every appliance, the HVAC, everything. On a clear, sunny stretch that summer, the system generated more power than I could even use. I also installed a charging outlet beside my driveway, built to charge my truck's auxiliary battery system and power my tools when I was working outside. It was mounted in a standard EV charger housing because that's a practical, weatherproof enclosure for that kind of connection. From the street, if you didn't know what you were looking at, it probably did look like a public or shared charger, but it was tied directly into my private system, not the grid, my system, power that I had engineered, installed, and paid for. I tell you all of this not to impress anyone. I tell you because what came later only makes sense if you understand that this was not just an electrical outlet to me. It was 2 years of my life, sitting right there at the end of my driveway. The lesson I would eventually learn from this whole situation is one that took me longer than it should have to absorb. Being generous with what you build is a good thing. Assuming other people will respect what you build without being told to is a different thing entirely. For the first few months after the system was complete, everything was peaceful. Quiet neighborhood, nice enough people, kids riding bikes in the evening. Nothing that suggested what was coming. But looking back now, I can see the first warning sign clearly. I just didn't recognize it for what it was at the time. I have known people in my life who wanted authority not because they had any particular vision for what to do with it, but simply because having it made them feel like they mattered more than the people around them. That is a specific kind of personality, and once you learn to recognize it, you see it everywhere. Carol Simmons was that kind of person. She lived 3 houses down from me on the same block, a tidy colonial with a perfectly edged lawn and window boxes that always had fresh flowers in them, the kind of detail that signals less a love of gardening and more a need to be seen as someone who has standards. She was in her early 50s, always dressed a little more formally than the occasion called for, blazer on a Saturday morning, clipboard at a neighborhood barbecue, the kind of woman who speaks in full sentences even when a short answer would do, because the length of the sentence is part of the point. She was the president of our homeowners association, had been for about 3 years by the time I finished my solar system. Nobody had voted her in with any particular enthusiasm, from what I could gather. She had just been the one willing to do it.
which in a lot of HOAs is all it really takes. Most people do not want to spend their evenings writing violation letters and attending board meetings about mailbox color codes. Carol did, or at least Carol wanted the authority that came along with those things, and she had used it. Over the years, she had cited neighbors for trash bins visible from the street. She had sent formal warnings about the angle of a flagpole. One family down the block told me they received 3 separate notices in a single summer about the color of their shutters not matching the approved palette in the HOA guidelines. 3 notices for shutter color. Most people in the neighborhood had adopted a quiet strategy of minimal engagement. You acknowledged Carol when you saw her, you did not invite deeper conversation, and you hoped she found someone else's property more interesting than yours. For a long time, that strategy worked for me. I kept to myself, did my work, minded my business. Then I finished the solar system, and the panels went up on the roof. Carol appeared in my driveway 2 days later, clipboard in hand, looking up at the roofline with an expression that was not quite disapproval and not quite curiosity. Something in between. The look of a person calculating what leverage a situation might offer them. She told me the panels had not been approved by the architectural committee. I told her I had city codes and that municipal code supersedes HOA guidelines. I showed her the paperwork. She stared at it for a moment, looked back up at the roof, and said the installation needed to maintain neighborhood harmony. I am not sure what that means about a solar panel, but I told her I was happy for her to review the legal framework anytime she wanted, and I went back inside. She left without another word, but there was something in the way she walked back down the driveway, unhurried, deliberate, like someone who has just noted something on a list they are keeping in their head that should have told me we were not finished. I let that moment go. I should not have, not because I was wrong about the permits, but because I had just learned something about Carol Simmons that I chose not to act on. She did not respond to being right. She responded to being challenged. And in her mind, showing her the paperwork was not resolution. It was the opening move. The thing about people who want power for its own sake is that they never really stop. They may go quiet for a while, but they are always watching for the next opening.
I have been a light sleeper most of my adult life. Something that comes with the job, I think. When you spend your working hours responsible for systems where a small failure can cascade into something much larger, you develop a habit of listening for things out of place even when you are supposed to be resting. But nothing in my working experience had prepared me for waking up at part 3, the alert that went off at 2 in the morning. I have been a light sleeper most of my adult life. Something that comes with the job, I think. When you spend your working hours responsible for systems where a small failure can cascade into something much larger, you develop a habit of listening for things out of place even when you are supposed to be resting. But nothing in my working experience had prepared me for waking up at 2 in the morning to a phone alert telling me that my private electrical system was being drained from the outside. When the monitoring alarm went off, my first thought was a fault in the system itself. A shorted connection somewhere, a battery bank showing an unexpected discharge, some internal issue I would need to trace in the morning. I checked the monitoring app from bed first, the way you do when you are hoping the problem resolves itself before you have to get up. But the readout made no sense for an internal fault. The draw was coming from the exterior outlet. Something had plugged into my charger port. I pulled on a jacket and went outside. The night was quiet. Streetlight throwing its usual pale wash across the asphalt. Most of the houses dark, everybody tucked in. And there, parked at the edge of my driveway, was a silver Tesla Model Y, charging cable connected to my private outlet, dashboard glow faint through the windshield. Standing beside it, arms folded, wearing a hoodie over what appeared to be pajama pants, was Carol Simmons. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look like someone who had been caught doing something wrong.
She looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced that I had come outside. When I said her name, she looked over and said, and I remember this exactly, "Oh good, you're up." Then she gestured toward the charger, like she was explaining something obvious to someone slow on the uptake. "You weren't using it overnight, so I figured it wouldn't hurt." I stood there in the cold, trying to decide whether I had actually woken up or whether this was some kind of stress dream. I asked her what exactly she thought she was doing. She said she was borrowing a little electricity. There was a particular flatness in her voice when she said it. No apology in it, no discomfort, just the calm, matter-of-fact tone of someone who had already decided that what they were doing was reasonable and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. I told her to unplug the car and go home. She unplugged. She went home. And I stood there in my driveway in the middle of the night, watching her taillights disappear down the street. I did not sleep much after that, partly because I was unsettled, and partly because something had already shifted in the back of my mind, the quiet, methodical part that doesn't get emotional, that just starts asking questions. Questions like, if she was that comfortable doing this in front of me, how comfortable had she been doing it when I was not watching? The next morning, I got my answer, and it was worse than I had imagined.
One of the things that makes electrical engineering a satisfying field, and sometimes a humbling one, is that the data does not have a personality. It does not spin. It does not rationalize. It does not tell you what you want to hear. It just shows you what happened. I sat down at my workbench the next morning with a fresh cup of coffee and opened the full system log archive. I was not expecting much. I figured I would find 2 or 3 incidents, maybe a week's worth, something I could bring to Carol as documentation of a pattern and use to make the point firmly that this needed to stop. I had my printout paper loaded into the tray. What I found instead was 22 separate charging events spanning the previous 3 weeks, every single night. The pattern was identical each time. A load spike initiating somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, drawing current at a rate consistent with EV charging, sustaining for 3 to 4 hours, then dropping to 0 before 5 a.m. Night after night. No gaps, no missed nights. 22 of them. I sat there for a while, looking at that data, before I said or did anything. There is a specific feeling that comes over you when you realize the full scale of something you had only glimpsed the edge of. It is not quite anger, not right away. It is something closer to a kind of cold, clear understanding. The sensation of a picture coming into focus you had been seeing blurry for weeks without realizing it. 80 kilowatt hours, give or take, that was the total. 80 kilowatt hours drawn from a system I had designed, built, and paid for. And not by accident. Not by someone who stumbled across an outlet and made a one-time mistake. By someone who had made a deliberate decision 22 separate times to walk down the street in the middle of the night and take what was not hers. I printed every page, the timestamps, the load graphs, the duration logs, the battery discharge curves, showing the recovery time the next day when the solar panels recharged what had been taken. I organized them chronologically and put them in a folder. And then I sat very still for a few more minutes because I wanted to be certain I was thinking clearly before I did anything at all. This is the thing about living long enough to have been in a few difficult situations. You learn the hard way that what you do in the first hour after a discovery like this matters. The wrong response, too fast, too emotional, too loud, can cost you everything you might have gained by being right. The right response is slow, it is documented, it is quiet, and it waits until you know exactly what you are dealing with before it moves. I knew what I was dealing with. A woman who had access to my property,
who had decided that my work and my resources were available to her by her own definition, and who had exercised that decision every night for 3 weeks without a moment of hesitation. I closed the folder, I finished my coffee, and then I walked 3 houses down to have a conversation I should have been more prepared for than I was. I have had difficult conversations in my professional life. Conversations where I had to tell a plant manager that his facility was running a risk that could injure someone. Conversations where I had to document a colleague's error and present it to a supervisor. I am not someone who avoids conflict when something important is at stake, but I am also not someone who enjoys it. And I walked to Carol's house that morning, genuinely hoping, on some level, that there was an explanation I had not considered. Something that would make 22 nights of data make sense in a way that did not require the conclusion I had already reached. There was no such explanation. Carol did not offer one because she did not think she needed one. She answered the door in a blazer, at 10 in the morning on a weekday. Clipboard on the entryway table. She looked at the folder in my hand the way someone looks at a piece of mail they already know the contents of. I was measured. I laid out the numbers. I told her about the log data, the timestamps, the 80 kilowatt hours, the 3-week pattern. I told her that the outlet was connected to my private off-grid system, not to any public utility or shared infrastructure, and that what she had been doing constituted using my property without my permission. I used clear language. I did not raise my voice. She listened, or appeared to, and then she told me that my charger was installed outside the home, in a shared residential community, and that she had assumed it was available when not in use. I said the word private again. She said renewable energy should not be hoarded. I showed her the total, 80 kilowatt hours. She looked at the number and said, and this is the part I have thought about many times since, you didn't pay for sunlight. Something about that line, the certainty of it, the way she delivered it without a flicker of self-awareness, like it was a philosophical position she had arrived at through careful reasoning rather than a rationalization she had constructed to cover something she already knew was wrong. I kept my voice level. I told her I was asking her, clearly and directly, to stop using the outlet. She told me that if I did not want people using it, I should not have installed something that looked like a public charger. Then she closed the door, turned the deadbolt. I heard the click of it from the porch. I stood there for a moment looking at that door, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think it matters. It was not rage. It was not the kind of anger that makes you want to pound on the door and keep arguing. It was something quieter and in some ways more clarifying than anger. It was the recognition that I was dealing with someone who had fully committed to a position and was never going to move from it through conversation. There are people who, when confronted with evidence of something they have done wrong, will feel shame and adjust. And there are people who, when confronted with the same evidence, simply dig in deeper. Not because they think they are right, but because admitting they are wrong feels more dangerous to them than the alternative. Carol was the second kind of person. And once you understand that about someone, you stop trying to persuade them. You start building your case. That evening, sitting at my workbench, I made a decision. I was done trying to resolve this through words. From this point forward, everything I did was going to be documented, structured, and prepared for a situation more formal than a conversation on a front porch. What I did not know yet was how much more formal things were about to get, not because of anything I did, but because of what arrived in my mailbox 5 days later. I have received a fair amount of official mail in my life. Tax documents, permit approvals, professional licensing renewals. The kind of envelopes you open with a certain business-like efficiency because you know more or less what they contain.
but nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I pulled out of my mailbox that Thursday afternoon. It was an official HOA notice, printed on HOA letterhead, formatted like a genuine legal document, signed by Carol Simmons in her capacity as HOA president. It cited me for a violation described as energy exclusivity practices inconsistent with community resource sharing. I stood at the mailbox and read that phrase 3 times. According to the letter, my solar system constituted externally accessible energy infrastructure, and by restricting HOA member access to that infrastructure, I was limiting what the letter called shared utility benefits available to community residents. Let me say that again in plain language so it is completely clear. Carol Simmons had taken the fact that she had been stealing electricity from my private system for 3 weeks, and she had reframed it as my violation. I was the one in the wrong, according to this letter, for refusing to let her take it. I went inside and sat down, and I had the strange experience of not knowing whether to laugh or to feel genuinely alarmed. Because even though the citation was obviously absurd, it was written in formal language on official letterhead, and I knew that some people, when they receive that kind of document, simply comply. They assume there is some authority behind it. They do not look too closely. They apologize and adjust their behavior. And I suspect that is exactly what Carol was counting on. I called Ray Kowalski that evening. Ray and I had worked together at a plant outside Phoenix years before he moved into residential electrical design. He's the kind of person who brings the same analytical rigor to a bad idea that he brings to a circuit diagram. He examines it until he finds exactly where it fails. I read him the letter over the phone. There was a pause. Then he laughed for about 30 seconds straight. When he recovered, he asked me what I was going to do. I told him I was not entirely sure yet. I knew the citation had no legal standing. Private off-grid systems do not fall under HOA utility jurisdiction, and there is no mechanism by which an association can compel a homeowner to share self-generated power that never touched the public grid. But knowing something has no legal standing and making that clear in a way that actually resolves the situation are two different things. Ray said something during that conversation that I have thought about many times since. He said that the problem with people like Carol is not that they are stupid. Carol was not stupid. The problem is that they have spent long enough operating without consequences that they genuinely cannot picture what consequences look like. And the only way to change that picture is to make the consequences real and visible in a way that cannot be dismissed or reframed. He started talking about circuit design, about protective relay systems, about the way you engineer a boundary into a system when you need that boundary to hold, regardless of whether the other party respects it. And I started listening very carefully. I want to be precise about something before I describe what I built, because I think precision matters here, and I have thought carefully about where the line is. What Ray described, and what I designed and constructed over 3 evenings in my garage, was a protective voltage spike relay. It is a circuit device, not a weapon, not a trap in any Hollywood sense of the word, but a system response mechanism that engineers use to protect equipment from unauthorized loads. When something connects to the port and draws current, the relay detects the draw and discharges a controlled voltage surge that kills the connection. The surge is not dangerous to a person. It will not cause physical injury. What it will do is destroy whatever cheap cable is connecting the unauthorized device, and it will trip the protection systems in whatever equipment is connected on the other end, hard enough to make an impression. Think of it less like a booby trap and more like a lock that fights back. I spent the first evening on the design, the second on fabrication, the third on testing and installation. I mounted the relay unit in a housing identical to the original charger, same enclosure, same position at the end of the driveway. The real outlet was rerouted inside the garage behind a locked panel accessible only by code.
I tested the relay's response time repeatedly until I was satisfied. 10 seconds from connection to discharge. Long enough for someone to commit to what they were doing, short enough to be absolutely certain. Then I did something that, in retrospect, was both the right thing to do and the thing that would later prove important in a different way. I went to the hardware store and bought a bright yellow sign, the kind used on electrical panels and equipment, and I mounted it directly above the charger port. Private power system, do not use. Clear, visible, unambiguous. The kind of sign that, if you choose to ignore it, tells a very specific story about your intentions. Ray had said one other thing in our phone conversation that stayed with me. He said that the people who design systems for a living understand something that most people do not. You cannot negotiate with a recurring fault. You can document it, you can issue warnings, you can make your position absolutely clear, and if the fault continues, the system has to respond. That is not anger, that is engineering. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing sitting in that garage finishing the installation. There was something there, underneath the technical focus. A kind of weariness, maybe. The feeling of a man who had tried the reasonable thing, the direct thing, the documented thing, and had watched all of it bounce off someone who had decided none of it applied to her. I had spent 2 years building something I was proud of. I had asked once, clearly and directly, for that work to be respected. I had been laughed at and had a door shut in my face, and then I received a citation in the mail for my trouble. There comes a point where you stop trying to change how someone thinks, and you simply change what their choices cost them. That point for me was a Saturday evening in early autumn with a glass of iced tea and a camera feed covering my driveway end to end.
I have never been a dramatic person. I do not enjoy confrontation. I do not have any particular taste for situations where things fall apart loudly and in public. So when I sat down at the monitoring console on that Saturday night, part of me was genuinely hoping that nothing would happen, that Carol had decided the outlet was no longer worth the trouble, that she had found a public charging station somewhere in town and moved on. I poured a glass of iced tea around 11:30, pulled up the camera feed, watched the driveway and the street beyond it, quiet under the streetlights. A cat moved through somebody's yard across the road. A porch light came on and went off 2 houses down. Midnight. Nothing. 12:15. Still quiet. I started to feel the particular self-consciousness of a man sitting alone in a garage at midnight watching an empty driveway, wondering if he had miscalculated, wondering if the problem had simply resolved itself without the resolution he had built. At 12:42, headlights turned onto our street from the far end. A silver Tesla, moving slowly, no rush. The car of someone who had done this many times and expected to do it again without incident. Carol parked beside the driveway, stepped out in pajama pants and a dark hoodie, the same way you step out of a car at your own home, unhurried, completely at ease. She looked down the street in each direction once, the way someone checks for parking enforcement, not for witnesses. Then she walked to the outlet. The yellow sign was there, right above the port, at eye level, impossible to miss. I watched her stop. I watched her look at it. And for just a moment, one genuine moment, I thought she might turn around. I thought the sign might do what the conversation and the letter and the documented evidence had not managed to do, which is introduce a small measure of doubt into a person who had been operating entirely without it. She shrugged, picked up the cable, plugged it into her car. On my monitor, the relay armed. I watched the indicator. 10 seconds. Long enough for her to settle against the car. Long enough for her to take out her phone and start scrolling. Long enough for her to be completely committed to what she was doing and entirely unprepared for what came next. The driveway lit up white. There was a crack, sharp, electric, the sound of a system reacting the way it was designed to react. Sparks came off the port in a brief cascade.
Carol's Tesla went dark instantly. Every interior light gone, the charging indicator dead, and Carol Simmons stumbled backward across my driveway and screamed at a volume I can only describe as comprehensive. I sat in the garage with my iced tea, watched her regain her footing, watched her look at the port, then at the darkened car, then back at the port, watched her pick up her phone, watched her get back in the car, which, to its credit, started fine because Tesla builds good protection systems, and drove away without looking at my house. I sat there for a while after she left, not feeling triumphant exactly, feeling something more like tired, the kind of tired that comes from a situation that should have been simple being made complicated by someone who did not need to make it complicated. All she had needed to do was respect a boundary, one boundary. The rest of it, every log page, every documented charging event, every letter, every conversation, every engineering hour in that garage, none of it had to happen. But it had happened, and now we were going to find out what Carol Simmons did when the world finally pushed back. I did not have to wait long to find out. She was at my door before 9 the next morning.
The pounding on my front door the next morning was the kind that suggests the person on the other side isn't entirely certain the door is solid enough and wants to verify. I heard it from the bedroom and took my time getting there, not out of spite, but because I needed a moment to be steady, to be the version of myself that had prepared for this, rather than the version that might say something it would regret. Carol was on the porch. Behind her stood two members of the HOA board, Paul Garrett, a quiet, retired school teacher who mostly attended meetings without saying much, and Erica Holt, a woman in her early 40s who I recognized from her morning walks with a yellow lab. Both of them had the expression of people who had been told one version of a story and were not entirely sure how much of it to believe. Carol had a version of events prepared. Gary had installed a sabotage device on a community charging station. Gary had intentionally damaged her vehicle. Gary was a hazard to the neighborhood. I let her finish. Then I stepped back inside the house. Carol started talking again behind me, louder. I did not hurry. I had put together a binder the night before, not because I knew for certain she would come, but because I had learned by that point that the difference between being right and being believed is documentation. Inside the binder, every log printout, chronologically organized, every timestamp, the power draw graphs from each of the 22 charging sessions, and the security camera screenshots, clear, well lit by the driveway light, date and time-stamped, showing Carol walking up to the outlet, plugging in, standing beside the car while it charged, night after night, her face visible in several of them. I handed the binder to Paul. He opened it. He is a methodical man, the kind of person who reads what is in front of him before forming an opinion. He turned the pages slowly. He looked at the timestamps. He looked at the photographs. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Carol. "Diane," he said, then caught himself. "Carol, did you actually plug your car in here multiple times?" Carol said that was not the issue. Erica said quietly that it seemed like it probably was. Carol said Gary had created a dangerous device. I said I had built a protective relay to prevent unauthorized loads on a private off-grid electrical system and posted a clearly visible warning sign above the port. Paul asked if the car was damaged. I said from what I could observe, the charging cable appeared to have failed and the car's internal protection systems had tripped. But the vehicle itself was likely fine. Carol said I was admitting to sabotage. I said I was describing standard protective circuit behavior. Paul turned to the camera photographs near the back of the binder. He was quiet for a moment. Erica leaned over to look and said softly, "Oh, wow." Carol said the footage had been taken without her consent. I said it had been taken on my property. Paul closed the binder. He told Carol, in the careful language of someone who has spent a career managing difficult moments in a classroom, that the situation was more complicated than the complaint she had filed suggested. Carol told him that the neighborhood had standards. Paul said yes, and that theft was generally one of them. She grabbed the binder from my hands and shoved it back toward me, told me I would be hearing from the board. Then she walked down my driveway and onto the street, already on her phone, already building the next version of the story. Paul and Erica stayed a moment longer. Paul handed me back a loose page that had fallen out of the binder during Carol's exit. He gave me a small nod, said it was a nice system. Then they followed her down the street. I stood on the porch watching all three of them walk away, and I felt, for the first time in this whole ordeal, something close to calm. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction, just the quiet that comes when you have done everything correctly and the record shows it, and there is nothing left to do but wait for the situation to resolve itself. That resolution came, though not in the way I expected, and it did not come from any confrontation or board meeting or formal proceeding. It came quietly, the way these things sometimes do, when a person finally runs out of room to operate. A few weeks after that Sunday morning on my porch, Carol Simmons stepped down from her position as HOA president. The official statement cited personal time commitments. The language was vague and cordial, the kind of resignation letter designed to give everyone a graceful exit without anyone having to say what actually happened. But in a neighborhood of 40-something households, where people talk across back fences and wave from driveways and notice which cars are parked where on what nights, the actual story had moved through the block long before any official announcement. I did not spread it. I did not need to. Carol had parked her Tesla in my driveway at 12:42 in the morning, screamed loud enough to illuminate several bedroom windows, and driven away with a scorched charging cable. These things do not go unnoticed in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I never installed a replacement decoy charger, never needed to. The original outlet stayed behind the locked panel in the garage. My system ran on, logging every draw, every voltage level, every sunny afternoon of solar recovery, quietly, exactly as designed. Paul Garrett was elected as the new HOA president at the next quarterly meeting. He called me about a month later to let me know, which I thought was a decent thing to do. He mentioned, without elaborating, that several board members had reviewed the full log documentation I had provided, and that the violation notice issued to me had been formally withdrawn and expunged from the HOA records. He did not make a production of it, he just said it clearly, the way a man who has seen enough of the world says things that need to be said without dressing them up. I thanked him, and we talked for a few minutes about solar systems, because it turned out Paul had been thinking about installing panels on his own property. I told him what I knew. It was a good conversation. I have thought a lot in the months since all of this about what the real lesson of the experience was. Not the practical lessons. Those are obvious. Document everything, understand your rights before a conflict makes you need to, keep clean records, know exactly what your property encompasses and what is connected to it. Those things matter, and they are worth knowing. But the deeper lesson, the one that took me longer to arrive at, is about patience and where its limits ought to be. I am a patient man by nature. I was raised to be. You give people the benefit of the doubt. You try the conversation first. You assume misunderstanding before you assume malice. Those are good instincts, and I do not think I will ever fully let go of them. But patience without a limit is not a virtue. It is an invitation. Carol charged her car on my power 22 times, not because I was absent or inattentive, but because I had spent enough years being reasonable that she calculated, correctly for a while, that I would keep being reasonable no matter what she did. The moment I stopped accepting that was the moment the situation changed. Not because I yelled or threatened or escalated in any dramatic way, but because I made clear, in a language she could not dismiss or reframe or issue a citation about, that the boundary was real and it was going to hold.
Some evenings now, I sit in the garage for a while after I finish whatever I am working on, and I look at the monitoring screen and I watch the system do what it does, drawing from the batteries, balancing the load, logging every detail of every hour. $30,000 and 2 years of my life. Every watt from my own roof. Still mine. That feeling has not changed. If anything, it is a little stronger now than it was before. What I hope, if you take anything from this story, is this. Know what is yours. Keep the records that prove it. Give people the chance to do right. And when they choose not to, do not waste your time hoping they will change their minds. Build the thing that holds the boundary instead. Let the system do what systems are supposed to do. And if someone tells you that you did not pay for the sunlight, just smile, because you know exactly what you paid for, and so do they.